It's a Spotify podcast.
You pushed me down, thought I'd stay on the ground, counting me.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining another episode, I should say, of Rabbit Holes Deep Dive. This is where we take a subject and dive into it and do research and everything like that. And tonight, it's the mind is not a truth machine. Imagine this. Two people stand only for a few feet apart. They watch the exact same event, the same words, the same actions, the same people, the same evidence. Minutes later, they begin describing what happened. One says, "It was obvious." The other one replies, "No, it was obvious you completely misunderstood." Neither person is lying. Neither person believes they're being dishonest. Both are intelligent. Both are paying attention. Both are sincerely believe the evidence supports their conclusion. So how is that possible? How can two honest people, looking at the same reality, walk away believing completely different things? Most of us think we already know the answer. We blame misinformation, politics, the media, education, social media, or we blame the other person. They're biased. They're irrational. They're brainwashed. They just don't want to see the truth. But what if the biggest obstacle to finding the truth isn't someone else's mind? What if it's our own? Because here's something psychologists have discovered over decades of research. The human mind was never designed to be a perfect truth machine. It wasn't built to record reality like a security camera. It wasn't built to weigh every piece of evidence with perfect objectivity. It wasn't built to reach the most accurate conclusions every time. Instead, it evolved to solve many different problems at once. Stay alive, find patterns, build relationships, protect your family, maintain your reputation, belong to a group, avoid unnecessary dangers, create meaning. Most of the time, those goals work together. Sometimes they don't. And when they conflict, truth doesn't always win. That's a deeply uncomfortable idea because we'd all like to believe we're different, that we follow evidence wherever it leads, that we're willing to change our minds, that other people are biased, but we're objective. Psychologists have a fascinating name for this tendency: the bias blind spot. The tendency to recognize cognitive bias in everyone except ourselves. It's one of the most ironic discoveries in all of psychology. The better we become at spotting flawed thinking, is easier it becomes to miss our own. Tonight, we're not going to laugh at conspiracy theories. We're not going to mock political opponents. We're not going to ridicule people who believe strange things because that's too easy. Instead, we're going to ask a much deeper, uncomfortable question. Why do perfectly ordinary people just like you and me, people just like me, sometimes believe things that aren't true? Why does reputation make false claims feel familiar? Why can vivid memories be completely wrong? Why do intelligent people sometimes become better? Not at finding the truth, but at defending the wrong answer. Why do groups of brilliant people make disastrous decisions? Why can facts fail to change minds? And why, in the age of artificial intelligence, might the greatest misinformation threat not be convincing people to believe one particular lie, but convincing them that nothing can be known with certainty at all. The deeper we travel into this rabbit hole, the stranger the story becomes, because false beliefs rarely begin with false information. They usually begin with something much more human. A need to belong, to understand, to feel safe, to protect the people we love, to defend who we believe we are. And once a belief satisfies one of those needs, facts alone may no longer be enough to remove it. This isn't a story about gullible people. It's a story about human nature. Because if psychology has taught us anything, it's this. The easiest false belief to recognize is the one held by someone else. The hardest one to discover is the one quietly living inside your own mind. Welcome to the rabbit hole's deep dive. Most people believe their eyes tell them the truth. After all, seeing is believing, right? Imagine you're walking through a parking lot late at night. One corner of your eye, you catch movement. Your heart races. For a split second, you're convinced someone is standing behind you. Then you look again. It's a shopping cart. Nothing changed. The parking lot didn't change. The lighting didn't change. The object didn't change. Only your interpretation changed. That tiny moment reveals something extraordinary. Your brain doesn't simply receive reality. It predicts it. Long before you're consciously aware of what you're seeing, your brain has already begun making educated guesses based on experience, memory, expectation, emotion, context. The world feels immediate. But neuroscience tells a different story. Your eyes don't transmit a perfect recording. They send incomplete information. Your brain fills in the gaps thousands of times every second. Most of the time, those predictions are remarkably accurate. Our ancestors wouldn't have survived. Imagine if every time every human walked through a forest, their brains had to analyze every leaf, every shadow, every sound from scratch. That wouldn't have lived long enough to become our ancestors. Instead, the brain became a prediction machine. It learned patterns. It recognized faces. It anticipated danger. It built shortcuts. Those shortcuts have allowed humans to react in milliseconds instead of minutes. But every shortcut comes with a trade-off. Speed often comes at the expense of perfect accuracy. Psychologists call this constructive perception. We don't passively receive reality. We actually construct our experience of it. That idea sounds strange at first, until you realize how often you experience it yourself. Have you ever searched anywhere for your car keys, only to discover they were sitting directly in front of you? You weren't blind. Your attention was somewhere else. The information reached your eyes. It never reached your awareness. Attention isn't simply about seeing, it's about selecting. At every moment, your brain filters almost everything around you. The feeling of your socks against your feet, the pressure of the chair beneath you, the sound of distant traffic, the hum of electricity. They're all there. You simply stopped noticing. Because if your brain processed every sensation equally, you'd never be able to focus on anything. Attention acts like a spotlight. Where it shines, experience becomes visible. Where it doesn't, reality can disappear entirely. And here's where things become even stranger. The same filtering happens when information. Suppose you buy a blue pickup truck. Suddenly, Blue pickup trucks seem to be everywhere. Did thousands of people rush out and buy one overnight? Of course not. They were always there. Your brain simply decided they were now important. Your brain simply decides they were now important. Psychologists sometimes call this the frequency illusion or the Brader-Meinhof phenomenon. Once something enters your awareness, your brain begins noticing it everywhere. Again, nothing changed in the world. Only your attention changed. This principle reaches far beyond cars. Imagine someone convinced that people are becoming increasingly rude. Without realizing it, their attention begins collecting evidence. A driver cuts them off. A cashier forgets to smile. Someone interrupts during a meeting. Each event strengthens the story. Meanwhile, acts of kindness quietly pass unnoticed. Not because they didn't happen, because they weren't being searched for. The brain isn't trying to deceive us. It's trying to be efficient. And efficiency requires prediction. The problem is, predictions influence perception. Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that strike that. And efficiency requires prediction. The problem is, predictions influence perception. Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated. The brain isn't trying to deceive us. It's trying to be efficient. And efficiency requires prediction. The problem is, predictions influence perception. Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that expectations affect what people notice, how they interpret ambiguous situations, and even what they later remember seeing. Reality arrives, expectation edits it. This doesn't mean we hallucinate the world. It means our experience of reality is always a collaboration between what's happening outside us and what's already happening inside us. Then comes memory. Most people think memory works like a video recording. Something happens. The brain stores it. Years later, you press play. Simple, except that's almost completely wrong. Memory isn't a playback. It's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, your brain rebuilds it, piece by piece, using surviving details, emotion, context, later experiences, general knowledge, even things other people told you afterwards. Imagine reading your favorite childhood book. Years later, you discover entire scenes you vividly remember were never actually written. Your mind quietly filled them in. Elizabeth Lotus and other memory researchers spent decades demonstrating just how malleable memory can be. In one famous line of research, simply changing one word in a question altered what people later reported remembering. Participants watched the same car accident. Some were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others were asked how fast they were going when they smashed into each other. That one word, smashed, didn't merely change speed estimates. It also influenced later recollections. Some participants became more likely to remember broken glass that had never existed. Think about that. The event didn't change. The question changed. And eventually, the memory changed. This became known as the misinformation effect. Not because people were lying, because memory is less like opening a filing cabinet and more like rebuilding a story. Now imagine this. Process. Know me? Strike that. and more like rebuilding a story. Now imagine this process happening not over minutes, but over years. Friends tell you their version. News reports provide new details. Social media adds opinions. Family members remember things differently. Eventually, your memory isn't simply your own. It becomes a collaboration between experience and everything that happened afterward. That's why confidence can be so misleading. Most of us assume confident memories must be accurate, but research repeatedly shows that confidence and accuracy are related only imperfectly. Confidence grows through repetition, emotion, familiarity, agreement. A vivid false memory can feel just as real as a true one. That's one of the most unsettling discoveries in modern psychology. Feeling certain is not the same thing as being correct. And if our perception can be influenced and our memories can be reconstructed, then perhaps the next question isn't whether our minds sometimes make mistakes. Perhaps the better question is, what happens when our minds begin defending those mistakes instead of correcting them? Imagine your mind as a courtroom. Every day, thousands of ideas enter. Some are true, some are false, some are uncertain, some are impossible to know. Now imagine there are two very different ways this courtroom can operate. In the first, the judges enter. Every claim is examined carefully. Evidence is weighed. Alternative explanations are considered. Witnesses are questioned. Weak arguments are rejected. Strong arguments survive. The goal is simple: find the truth. But now, imagine a different courtroom. The verdict has already been decided. The defense attorney doesn't ask what actually happened. Instead, they ask, how do I prove my client is innocent? Every witness is filtered through that goal. Evidence helping the defense is welcomed. Evidence helping the prosecution is challenged. Contradictions are explained away. Weaknesses are minimized. The objective isn't discovery, it's victory. Here's the unsettling part. Your brain is capable of running both courtrooms. Psychologist Zivra Kendra helped explain this through one of the most influential ideas in modern psychology. Sometimes our minds are driven by what researchers call accuracy motivation. We generally want the most defensible conclusion. When accuracy is the goal, people tend to slow down. Consider competing explanations. Pay closer attention to evidence quality. Become more willing to admit uncertainty. Changing your mind becomes a success, not a failure. But there is another mode: directional motivation. This occurs when we already prefer a particular answer, not necessarily because we're dishonest, because one conclusion simply feels better than another, safer, kinder, more hopeful, less threatening, more consistent with who we believe we are. Suddenly, our reasoning changes. Without realizing it, we begin searching for evidence that supports the conclusion we wanted all along. This isn't conscious deception. Most people sincerely believe they're being objective. That's what makes motivated reasoning so powerful. It rarely feels motivated. Imagine a lifelong investor convinces a certain company is destined to succeed. Good news receives immediate attention. Bad news gets dismissed as temporary. Critical reports come from people who don't understand. Positive reports come from credible experts. Nothing changed about the evidence, only the standard used to evaluate it. Now replace the company with politics, religion, nutrition, medicine, climate, technology, parenting, history. The pattern remains remarkably similar. our brains become extraordinarily creative, then defending conclusions that protect something important to us. Researchers have repeatedly found that intelligence doesn't automatically eliminate this tendency. In some situations, it actually strengthens it. That sounds backwards. Should smarter people be harder to fool? Often they are. But intelligence also provides something else: better arguments, more information, greater verbal skills, a large library of memories, more sophisticated explanations. Think about brilliant attorneys. A skilled lawyer can build an extraordinarily persuasive argument. Whether the client is innocent or guilty, intelligence is a tool. The question isn't simply how intelligent is someone. The more important question is, what goal is their intelligence currently serving? It is serving curiosity or protection, discovery or defense. That's why highly educated people can passionately disagree while each sincerely believes the evidence supports them. The disagreement doesn't necessarily begin with different facts. It often begins with different goals. Then comes confirmation bias. It's one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology. People often imagine confirmation bias as intentionally ignoring facts. Reality is subtler and far more interesting. Confirmation bias operates before we even realize it. It influences what we search for, what we notice, what we remember, and what we forget. Suppose someone believes teenagers today are disrespectful. Then next week, they notice 3 rude teenagers. They tell friends, share stories, shake their heads. Meanwhile, hundreds of polite interactions quietly disappear into the background, not because they're denied, because they never became memorable. The mind wasn't collecting all examples. It was collecting confirming examples. Psychologists describe several forms of confirmation bias. Selective exposure. We naturally consume information from sources we already trust. Biased interpretation. Ambiguous evidence gets interpreted in ways supporting our existing beliefs. Selective memory. Supporting examples become easier to recall. Contradictions fade. Then there's asymmetric scrutiny. This one's fascinating. Imagine someone tells you something that perfectly matches your worldview. How much evidence do you demand? Probably not much. Now imagine someone makes opposite claims. Suddenly, questions appear. Where's the evidence? Who funded the study? Can that source be trusted? The sample size seems small. The standard of proof quietly changed, not because evidence changed, because the conclusion changed. Researchers have documented this repeatedly. We often become more skeptical when evaluating ideas we don't want to believe. Again, this doesn't make us irrational. It makes us human. Prior beliefs help organize an overwhelmingly complicated world. Without them, every conversation would begin from zero. Every decision would require endless analysis. Now imagine someone makes the opposite claim. Suddenly, questions appear. Where's the evidence? Who funded this study? Can that source be trusted? The sample size seems small. The standard of proof quietly changed, not because evidence changed, because the conclusion changed. Researchers have documented this repeatedly. We often become far more skeptical when evaluating ideas we don't want to believe. Again, this doesn't make us irrational. It makes us human. Prior beliefs help organize an overwhelmingly complicated world. Without them, every conversation would begin from zero. Every decision would require endless analysis. Every claim would demand complete reinvestigation. The brain simply doesn't have time or the energy. Shortcuts become necessary. The problem begins when those shortcuts become invisible, when assumptions quietly transform into certainty, when familiarity becomes evidence, when agreement becomes proof, when something extraordinary happens. Eventually, we stop defending an idea and begin defending ourselves. Because once a belief becomes part of our identity, changing our mind no longer feels like learning. It feels like losing a piece of who we are. And that's where one of the psychology's most influential theories enters the story. Cognitive dissonance. The uncomfortable feeling that arises when reality collides with the story we've been telling ourselves. Imagine spending 20 years building a house. Every weekend, every vacation, every spare dollar, you lay the foundation, raise the walls, install the roof, paint every room. Friends admire it, families celebrate it. Your identity becomes tied to it. Then one afternoon, an engineer quietly tells you something devastating. The foundation is cracked. At that moment, you have choices. Accept the evidence or protect everything you've invested. That tension lies at the heart of one of psychology's most influential theories, cognitive dissonance. Psychologist Leon Presslinger proposed that people experience psychological discomfort when their beliefs, their behavior, and their image conflict with one another. We don't like inconsistency, not because inconsistency is always dangerous, but because our minds crave coherence. We want our lives to make sense. Imagine someone who believes, I make excellent decisions. Then they discover they've been deceived, perhaps by a business partner, a political leader, a religious authority, a financial advisor, or someone they deeply trusted. Accepting that reality isn't simply admitting one mistake. It may require admitting years of mistakes. I ignored warning signs. I defended them. I convinced other people. I sacrificed time, money, relationships for something that wasn't true. That's an enormous psychological cost. Sometimes it's emotionally easier to interpret the evidence than reconstruct your identity. This helps explain something that has puzzled psychologists for decades. Why do some people become even more committed after evidence contradicts their beliefs? At first glance, it makes no sense. Shouldn't evidence weaken confidence? Sometimes it does, but not always. Because the evidence isn't challenging a single opinion. It's threatening entire worldview. Think about someone who has devoted decades to a cause, their friendships, their community, their purpose, their reputation may all be connected to one central belief. Changing their mind doesn't simply update one fact. It changes who they are. That's why psychologists increasingly distinguish between ordinary beliefs and identity beliefs. Some beliefs are like clothing, easy to change. Others are like skin. Removing them feels painful. Researchers call this identity protective reasoning. When evidence threatens something central to our identity, our brains often begin asking a different question. Not, is it true? But, what happens to me if this is true? Notice how different those two questions are. One searches for reality, the other searches for survival. And throughout most of human history, those two goals were deeply connected. Humans evolved in small groups. Acceptance wasn't simply pleasant, it was essential. Being rejected by your tribe often meant losing protection, resources, cooperation, and sometimes your life. So evolution rewarded minds that maintained social bonds, not minds that won every argument. That ancient survival system still operates today. Only now, the tribes have changed. Political parties, religious communities, professional organizations, online forums, fan communities, social movements, families, every group develops shared beliefs, shared language, shared heroes, shared enemies, and over time, those shared beliefs become signals, ways of saying, I belong. Social psychiatrists spend decades studying this phenomenon. One of the most surprising discoveries came from experiments where participants were randomly assigned to meaningless groups. Some preferred one abstract painting. Others preferred another. Some wore one colored shirts. Others wore a different color. That's all. No history, no culture, no competition, just arbitrary categories. Remarkably, people still began favoring members of their own group. Not because the groups meant anything, because the human mind naturally organizes the social world into us and them. Once those categories form, beliefs begin doing something beyond describing reality. They begin communicating loyalty. Imagine wearing your favorite sports team's jersey. The shirt isn't merely fabric, it's a signal. I'm one of us. Beliefs can function the same way. Sometimes saying, I believe this, also communicates, I stand with these people. I reject those people. I share these values. I can be trusted. Suddenly, changing your mind carries consequences far beyond being wrong. It may affect relationships, family relationships, professional reputation, community standing, perhaps even your sense of purpose. This helps explain why ridicule so often fails. When people feel mocked, the social cost of changing their mind increases. Imagine realizing you've been mistaken. Now imagine admitting it to the very people who laughed at you. That's incredibly difficult. Not because the evidence is weak, because dignity matters. Researchers consistently find that humiliation rarely opens minds. It usually hardens it. The argument isn't no longer about facts. It's about self-respect, which leads to one of the most important lessons in all of misinformation research. If you want someone to reconsider a belief, you must separate the belief from the person holding it. Challenge the idea. Preserve the dignity. Because once you retreat becomes socially impossible, commitment often becomes psychologically necessary. This becomes even more powerful inside groups. Imagine sitting around a conference table, 10 intelligent professionals, one difficult decision. Privately, several people believe proposal is flawed, but no one speaks. No one person assumes. Everyone else seems confident. Another thinks, I must be missing something. A third worries, I don't want to sound disloyal. Silence spreads, and suddenly everyone believes what everyone else agrees. Psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance. Most people privately disagree while publicly appearing unanimous. It's one of the quietest and most dangerous forms of self-deception, because once silence begins looking like agreement, Entire groups can convince themselves that nobody has doubts, and history shows that some of humanity's greatest failures begin exactly that way. History is filled with moments that seem impossible in hindsight. Entire governments making catastrophic decisions, corporations ignoring obvious warning signs, military leaders pursuing unwantable strategies, financial institutions repeating mistakes everyone promised could never happen again. Looking back, we often ask the same question: how could we see this many intelligent people have been so freaking wrong? The answer is that intelligence alone has never guaranteed good judgment. Sometimes the smartest people in the room become the most effective at convincing each other they're right. Psychologist Irving Janis spent years studying this phenomenon. He called it groupthink. Despite its name, groupthink isn't simply people agreeing with each other. Healthy groups agree all the time. Groupthink is something much more dangerous. It's what happens when preserving agreement becomes more important than discovering the truth. Imagine you're sitting in a boardroom. The CEO represents a bold new strategy. Everyone around the table nods. No objections. No difficult questions. No one asks, "What if we're wrong?" At first glance, it looks like confidence. But beneath the surface, something very different may be happening. One executive notices a flaw, but stays silent. Another has concerns, yet assumes everyone else knows something they don't. A third worries that disagreeing might damage their career. Every person interprets everyone else in silence as evidence that everyone agrees. No one realizes everyone else is having the exact same private doubt. That's groupthink. Not because people stopped thinking, but because they stopped experiencing what they were thinking. The result can be catastrophic. Janis argued that several conditions make groupthink more likely: highly cohesive groups, strong directive leaders, isolation from outside criticism, high pressure decisions, urgency, a belief that unity matters more than disagreement. Under those conditions, warning signs begin appearing. The group becomes convinced it can't fail. Critics are dismissed. Opponents are stereotyped as ignorant or malicious. People begin censoring themselves. Those who raise concerns are viewed as disloyal. Eventually, silence becomes mistaken for consensus. Researchers have debated exactly how often groupthink explains historical failures. Some argue Janis overstated its role. Others point out that many disasters involve far more complicated organizational problems. That's an important caution. Groupthink is one framework, not a universal law. But regardless of the theory's limits, the underlying psychological pattern remains deeply relevant. When disagreement becomes society expensive, truth becomes harder to discover. And this teaches us far beyond boardrooms. Think about social media, family gatherings, political movements, religious communities, professional organizations, even friendship circles. Every group develops unwritten rules, ideas that welcomed, questions that encouraged, topics that feel dangerous. People quickly learn which opinions earn approval and which invite criticism. Most of the time, they don't consciously choose conformity. They simply stop volunteering disagreement. That's what makes conformity so fascinating. It's often invisible. One of psychology's most famous demonstrations from Solomon Asch Participants entered what they believed was simple perception experiment. They looked at lines on a card. The task couldn't have been easier. Which line matches the reference line? The answer was obvious, except everyone else in the room intentionally gave the wrong answer, one after another, confidently, publicly. The participant now faced an unexpected dilemma: trust their own eyes or trust the unanimous group. Remarkably, many people publicly agreed with the incorrect majority at least some of the time. Not because they suddenly became blind, because social pressure changes behavior. Afterward, some participants admit they knew the group was wrong. They simply didn't want to stand out. Others generally began doubting their own perception. Think about that. Reality hadn't changed. The lines hadn't changed. Only the social environment changed. Yet, that was enough to influence public judgment. Now imagine replacing simple lines with politics, medical decisions, financial markets, scientific controversies, criminal investigations. The stakes become infinitely higher, and conformity becomes much more costly. This is why dissonant matters. Not because dissonant is always correct, because without dissonant, errors become invisible. Healthy organizations don't avoid disagreement. They design systems that protect it. They assign someone to argue the opposite case. They invite outside experts. They reward difficult questions. They separate criticism from disloyalty, because once disagreement disappears, the group loses one of its most important defenses against error. And yet, even groups aren't the deepest level of the story, because sometimes belief doesn't spread through pressure. It spreads through something far more satisfying: a story. One that explains everything. One that identifies heroes, villains, and the hidden motives. One that transforms uncertainty into certainty. And that's where we enter one of the most misunderstood areas in all of psychology: the psychology of conspiracy theories. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that every major news organization, every government, every scientist, every university, every journalist, every court, and every expert was lying to you. It's a terrifying thought, but it's also an incredibly satisfying story, because suddenly every confusing event has an explanation. Every contradiction has a cause. Every disappointment has an enemy. Every coincidence becomes a clue. Psychologists who study conspiracy beliefs have noticed something fascinating. Most conspiracy theories don't begin with a bizarre idea. They begin with ordinary human questions. Who benefits? What are they finding? What are they hiding? That doesn't seem to add up. Those are healthy questions. In fact, they're questions every good investigator should ask. Real conspiracies exist. History proves this. Governments have lied. Corporations have covered up misconduct. Financial fraud has occurred. Medical scandals have happened. Journalists have uncovered genuine secret operations. Questioning powerful institutions isn't irrational. Democracy depends on it. So the real psychological question isn't, why do people believe conspiracy? It's, how do we distinguish a real conspiracy from a conspiratorial worldview? Researchers studying conspiracy psychology have found that these beliefs often satisfy three deeply human needs. The first, is the need to understand. Psychologists call these epidemic motives. Human beings hate unanswered questions. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Imagine hearing a loud crash in your house at 3 o'clock in the morning. Your mind immediately starts searching for explanations. The cat, a burglar, the wind, a falling shelf. The uncertainty itself becomes stressful. The faster you find the explanation, the calmer you become. Conspiracy theories offer something incredibly attractive: simple explanations, clear villains, hidden motives, a complete story. Reality is rarely that neat. Most major events happen because of dozens, sometimes hundreds, interacting causes. Economic pressures, human error, miscommunication, bad incentives, chance, gag orders, institutional failures, random timing. Real life is messy. Conspiracy theories often aren't. They replace complexity with intention. And second psychological need is control. Researchers call these existential motives. Think about differences between two explanations. A devastating financial collapse happened because millions of people made independent decisions that interacted in unprecedented ways. Or a small group secretly planned everything. Ironically, the second explanation can feel less frightening. Because if someone is in control, then the world still makes sense. A hidden enemy is psychologically easier to understand than randomness. People can fight an enemy. It's much harder to fight chaos. Then comes the third motive: social identity, belonging. Imagine believing you're discovering something everyone else has missed. Suddenly, you're no longer confused. You're enlightened. You're part of the group that sees what's really happening. That feeling can be extraordinarily powerful. Not because people enjoy being wrong, because everyone wants to feel that their understanding matters. Researchers have found that conspiracy beliefs often strengthen during periods of uncertainty. Economic instability, political upheaval, pandemics, wars, rapid technological change, AI. Whenever society feels unpredictable, the demand for certainty increases, and certainty sells. Whether it's true or not, another fascinating concept is a pattern perception. The human brain evolved to recognize patterns remarkably well. If our ancestors failed to notice movement in tall grass, they might become dinner. Evolution rewarded false alarms. Mistaking the wind for a predator is embarrassing, but mistaking a predator for the wind can be fatal. That same survival system still operates today. Except now, instead of searching for predators, it searches for meaning. Sometimes it searches for genuine patterns. Sometimes it connects events that aren't actually connected. Coincidences become evidence. Timing becomes causation. Separate events become one coordinated plan. Then another cognitive shortcut appears. Psychologists call it proportionately biased. Humans naturally assume that major events require major causes. A global crisis feels too important to result from ordinary mistakes. A famous assassination seems too significant for one individual. A financial collapse feels too enormous to emerge from thousands of independent bad decisions. Emotionally, Big events deserve big explanations. Conspiracy theories often provide exactly that. But perhaps the most fascinating feature of some conspiracy theories is that they become almost impossible to disprove. Imagine someone says, the lack of evidence proves the conspiracy is covering its tracks. Now, imagine evidence appears contradicting the theory. They reply, of course, they create fake evidence. Experts disagree. They've all been bought. Prediction fail. The plan changed. Former believers leave. They were controlled opposition. Notice what happened. Every possible outcome became evidence supporting the belief. Psychologists describe this as self-sealing belief system. Not every conspiracy theory becomes self-sealing. Many are abandoned when evidence changes. But when a belief explains every possible observation, it stops functioning like scientific hypothesis. Scientific ideas survive by risking failure. They can be tested, questioned, potentially disproven. A belief that cannot be falsified cannot become stronger through evidence because it no longer depends on evidence. It depends on interpretation. And that's an important distinction because skepticism and cynicism are not the same thing. Healthy skepticism asks, what evidence supports this claim? Cynicism asks, nothing can be trusted. One searches for better evidence. The other gives up evidence entirely. That difference may become one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. Because if conspiracy theories offer one kind of certainty, modern technology offers something even more powerful. The ability to repeat the same story millions of times until familiarity itself begins to feel like proof. Imagine hearing the same sentence just once. You probably wouldn't think much about it. Now imagine hearing it again tomorrow. Then again the next week. A friend repeats it. You see it in a headline. Someone mentions it in a podcast. A social media post references it. A video quotes it. A politician repeats it. Months later, you can't remember where you first heard it. But it feels familiar. And that's the point. Psychologists have discovered something both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The human mind often mistakes familiarity for truth. Researchers call this the illusionary truth effect. Repeated statements become easier for the brain to process. Psychologists refer to this as processing fluency. The words require less mental effort. They feel smoother, more recognizable, more comfortable. And without realizing it, our minds often interpret that feeling of ease as evidence of accuracy. Notice what just happened. The calm didn't become more true. It became more familiar. Those are not the same things, yet our brains frequently treat them as if they are. One landmark series of experiments found that repetition could increase perceived accuracy, even when participants already possessed knowledge suggesting the statement was false. Knowledge helped, but it wasn't perfect protection. The mind quietly whispered, "You've heard this before. Maybe there's something to it." This gives misinformation an enormous advantage. It doesn't have to convince you immediately. It simply has to become familiar. Think about the first time you hear an unusual claim. It seems absurd. The 5th time, it sounds debatable. The 20th time, it starts sounding like something everyone is talking about. The claim hasn't accumulated evidence, it's accumulated exposure. Now imagine combining repetition with emotion, fear, anger, outrage, moral certainty, hope, surprise. Every one of those emotions makes information more memorable, not necessarily more accurate, more memorable. And that's where modern technology enters the story. Many people imagine social media algorithms as evil masterminds secretly deciding what humanity believes. That's not true. Reality is both less dramatic and perhaps more concerning. Algorithms don't need opinions. They don't need ideology. They don't need political beliefs. Most recommendation systems optimize for something more simpler: attention. If people click, watch, comment, share, or react, the system learns not what is true, what keeps people engaged. Imagine owning a bookstore. You place books near the entrance that customers keep picking up. Eventually, those books receive even more attention, not because you judge them to be the best, because people consistently interacted with them. Recommendation algorithms operate surprisingly same way, except instead of books, they're ranking millions of posts, millions of videos, millions of headlines every second. Researchers have repeatedly found that emotionally provocative content often attracts more engagement than calm, carefully qualified explanations. Think about which headline you're more likely to click. Scientists continue investigating possible causes. Or, everything you've been told is a lie. One is cautious. The other is irresistible. Truth often arrives with uncertainty. False certainty rarely does. Scientific research is filled with phrases like, the evidence suggests, current date indicates, further study is needed. That's how honest inquiry sounds. Misinformation doesn't have those constraints. It can promise certainty, clear villains, simple solutions, perfect confidence. Reality is complicated. Stories don't have to be. Then another psychological force quietly joins the system: social proof. Human beings constantly use other people as evidence. If thousands of people applaud, we assume something must be worth hearing. If millions watch a video, we assume it must matter. If everyone in your village ran away from the forest, you probably shouldn't stop to conduct your own investigation. Following the crowd often kept your ancestors alive. Online, that same instinct can be manipulated. Likes, shares, followers count. Trending list, comment totals, these signals feel like evidence. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're simply evidence that many people interacted with something. These aren't identical. The internet introduced another remarkable phenomenon: echo chambers. But researchers have become increasingly careful about how they use that term. People often imagine echo chambers as completely isolated worlds where nobody ever encounters opposing opinions. That evidence is more complicated. Many users actually see plenty of opposing viewpoints. That problem isn't always exposure, it's interpretation. Imagine every opposing article arrives accompanied by comments saying, "Look how ridiculous these people are." The information crossed the boundary, but the frame came with it. Instead of encouraging understanding, the opposing view strengthens identity. Researchers distinguish this from something called a filter bubble. A filter bubble limits what you see. An echo chamber teaches you whom not to trust. That's a profound difference. One filters information, the other filters credibility. Eventually, outside disagreement stops functioning as evidence. It becomes the evidence. What outsiders can't be trusted. Now that system begins protecting itself. Every contradiction confirms the worldview. Every contradiction becomes suspicious. Every critic proves the point. Sound familiar? We've been this pattern before. It's the same psychological architecture underlying self-sealing belief systems. Only now it's reinforced by social networks, recommendation systems, identity, and reputation. Only now it's reinforced by social networks, recommendation systems, identity, and reputation. Strike that. It's the same psychological architecture underlying self-sealing belief systems. Only now it's reinforced by social networks, recommendation systems, identity, and reputation. It's the same psychological architecture underlying self-sealing belief systems. Only now it's reinforced by social networks, recommendation systems, identity. This creates one of the greatest challenges of the digital age. The problem isn't simply that false information spreads, it's that information now spreads inside systems significantly designed to maximize engagement. And engagement doesn't ask one simple question: is this true? It asks, will people pay attention? That's a very different objective. Perhaps the algorithm doesn't know what truth is. Perhaps it never will. It doesn't have to. It only has to become exceptionally good at predicting what human beings find impossible to ignore, which leaves us with one final question. If every human mind is vulnerable, if every group can become insulated, if every platform amplifies attention rather than accuracy, how do we actually become better at finding the truth? Let's go back to where we began. Two people standing side by side, watching the exact same event, both convinced they saw truth. By now, that scene probably looks very different because we've learned something unsettling. The disagreement began with the evidence. It began long before the evidence ever arrived. It began with memory, expectation, identity, belonging, emotion, trust, attention, experience. Every one of us walks into every conversation carrying an invisible map of reality. That map helps us make sense of what the world, but every map is incomplete. Throughout this journey, we've discovered that human minds isn't defective, it's adaptive. Confirmation bias isn't a software bug, it's an efficiency shortcut. Motivated reasoning isn't proof that people are dishonest. It's evidence that human beings care about more than facts alone. Memory isn't broken, it's reconstructive. Groups don't always silence dissident because people are foolish. They often do it because belonging has always mattered. Every conspiracy theory often begins with completely human needs. The need to understand, the need to feel safe, the need to believe that someone, somewhere, is in control. None of these psychological systems evolved to deceive us. They evolved to help us survive. The problem is the modern information world is unlike anything evolution prepared us for. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in small communities. Information traveled slowly. Rumors spread by words of mouth. Trust was built face to face. Mistakes were usually local. Today, one false claim can circle the globe in minutes. Artificial intelligence can generate millions of convincing images, millions of articles, millions of videos every hour, not because the technology wants to deceive us, because technology amplifies whatever people choose to create. And that changes the challenge completely. The future of truth may no longer depend only on discovering facts. It may depend on preserving something even more important: shared standards for deciding what counts as evidence. Because once people stop agreeing on how truth is established, facts alone become powerless. This may be the greatest danger of misinformation. Not that everyone believes the same lie, but that everyone stops believing that truth itself can be discovered. History has shown us that happens when societies lose trust, not healthy skepticism, complete distrust. Every document becomes fake. Every photograph becomes suspect. Every expert becomes corrupt. Every institution becomes legitimate. Every correction becomes propaganda. Every contradiction becomes proof of a cover-up. At that point, the question is no longer what is true. The question becomes, who do I trust? And once truth replaced entirely by the tribe, reason becomes almost impossible. But here's the hopeful part. Psychology also tells us something extraordinary. People do change their minds. Not always, not easily, but they do. Research consistently shows that corrections can work. Questions can work. Curiosity can work. Trusted relationships can work. Humility can work. The goal isn't to become perfectly objective. No human being is. The goal is to become aware of the forces quietly shaping our thinking. To pause before sharing. To ask, what evidence would actually change my mind? To separate disagreement from disrespect. To recognize when our identity has become attached to an idea. And to remember that changing your mind isn't weakness. It's one of the strongest demonstrations of intellectual courage. Because the smartest person in the room isn't the one who's never wrong. It's the one who can recognize it first. So the next time you hear a claim that instantly makes you angry or instantly makes you feel triumphant, pause. Ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true or because it satisfies something inside me? The next time someone disagrees with you, don't immediately ask, how can I prove them wrong? Ask, what are they seeing that I might be missing? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what belief do I hold so tightly that I would struggle to let it go, even if overwhelming evidence proved I was mistaken? Because the easiest false belief is to recognize will always be the one held by someone else. The most important one to discover is the one quietly living inside your own mind. If today's episode challenged the way you think, don't stop here. Read the research, study psychology, learn how memory works, learn how reasoning works, learn how manipulation works. Not so you can win more arguments, so you can become a better thinker. Because rabbit holes isn't about telling you what to believe. It's about giving you tools to think more carefully, more honestly, and more courageously. Now, I don't want to hear now. I do want to hear from you. What one belief you've changed your mind about, and what evidence convinced you? Leave it in the comments below. I am excited to hear from you guys, because sometimes The most powerful thing a person can say is four simple words. I was wrong. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can say is three simple words. I was wrong. My name is Leroy Nellis, and this is Resilience Radio. Godspeed, stand for the Constitution, protect your curiosity, protect your integrity, and never surrender your willingness to follow the evidence. Whatever it leads, God bless and good night. Hey everybody, I wanted to sit down with you today and talk about something we've been working on behind the scenes for quite a while now. First, I want to thank you. Whether you've been here from the beginning or you just found the channel recently, I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Every comment, every conversation, every suggestion, every word of encouragement has helped shape what Resilience Radio is becoming. This isn't just my channel anymore. It's about a community. And because of that, I wanted you to hear these changes directly from me. Over the last several months, we've been doing something a little unusual. We've been studying our analytics almost obsessively. Not just YouTube analytics, but the analytics coming from Naomi, the AI production system we've been building from the ground up. We've been asking questions like, what videos do people come here for? What keeps people watching? What topics naturally fit together? And what happens when we mix very little types of content on the same channel? After looking at thousands of data points, we came to one conclusion. It's time to let each series become a very best version of itself. So today, I'm excited to announce that Rabbit Holes is becoming its own dedicated YouTube channel. Rabbit Holes deserves its own home. It's where we dive into mysteries, history, unsolved questions, and rabbit holes. Strange events, forgotten stories, and all of those fascinating topics that make us lose track of time. By giving Rabbit Holes its own channel, YouTube can better understand who those videos are for. Our AI can learn from much cleaner data, and we can build something truly special for people who love those deep dives. Resilience Radio will continue doing what it has always meant to do, help people understand themselves through psychology,
You pushed me down, thought I'd stay on the ground, counting me out like the numbers didn't matter. But pressure builds diamonds in the dark, and I've been sharpening my edge in the chatter. Every scar turned into strategy, every setback fueled my clarity. I took the hits, learned the game, turned my losses into flame. Now I'm coming back strong, and you'll remember my name. I'm rising through the fire.